World Architecture Festival, and I've been associated with the Wren Talks since their inauguration, which rather extraordinarily turns out to be 10 years ago. They've been a very interesting and varied set of propositions, comments about London in the context of Wren, the fire, the plague, the art, the aesthetics, the economics and the politics. And I'd like to thank the rector of St Bride's, Alison Joyce, who's here this evening, for her ongoing support for this annual talk. I'd like to thank the sponsor of the talk, the Wren Insurance Group, appropriately named. And I'd like to thank Gerald Bowie, who's been the sort of moving force behind organising this for the last decade. This is the eve of Christopher Wren's birthday. As I've mentioned, it's the 10th talk in our series, and I'm delighted to introduce this evening Tony Travers, who's, amongst other things, is Professor at the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, and I'm sure will be familiar to many of you as a voice of reason, if I could put it that way, on the Today programme as they try to grapple with the implications of national policy for local authorities, and sometimes more specifically about the arrangements by which London itself is governed. I can recommend, if you haven't read it, a book produced, I think about 5 years ago now, that Tony produced on 50 years of London boroughs, the great reorganisation of London in the 1960s, when old London was transformed into the political structure we have today. And I was just reminding myself that on the flyleaf of that particular book was a reference to another book that Tony had written, which was about London governing an ungovernable city. And we've asked Tony to talk this evening about this great capital, this great centre, this great urban agglomeration in the context of its very recent history of pandemic and financial crash and so on and so forth. And, you know, for people who've attended these talks before, what Wren dealt with and what his contemporaries dealt with were the consequences of fire and plague, which actually architecturally, of course, produced probably the greatest series of architectural projects that the capital has ever seen, i.e. Wren's churches, but also institutional arrangements, for example, the fire courts, which had ended up dealing with the property and financial consequences of ownership in relation to those ghastly events. So please welcome Tony Travers.
Well, a very good evening to you all. As I'm sure everybody has heard other people say at events of this kind in the last few weeks, how nice it is to be able to see everybody again and to meet people in real life as opposed to over a Zoom or Teams meeting. So it's so great to see you. I'd like to thank the rector and also Paul and everybody who's been involved, Sir Christopher Wren, obviously. And as Paul has said, I'm going to talk about COVID-19, but I'm going to talk about it in a rather long historical context, as the picture of Roman London begins to hint at. I'll try and do this for about 45 minutes, so there's hope for you. What I want to do is to effectively to build up a case based on the way London has been affected by serious and bad events of different kinds over its full 2,000-year history. Because, of course, since its settlement by the Romans, London has periodically seen events which cause immense damage to the city, to London. It's seen invasion, it's seen fire, the city, not only in 1666, different historical event, 1066, it's seen disorder and rioting, civil disturbance. It's seen terrorism, war and disease, which I think in some ways is the most prevalent and recurrently destructive of all of these difficult things. But what I want to do is to look at all of them and then draw some broad lessons about them and to try to infer from them what they give us, what clues they give us about how COVID might affect the city in the medium to long term. There are common threads to all of these events, and the common threads are magnified by London's scale, its density, its economic importance, the enormous amount of political power at any time. It's the seat of government and the seat of the monarchy, now slightly different things, but previously the same thing. And of course, because it's such a big city, I mean, obviously, when this church was initially built, it was a much smaller city, but it was still a big city compared with all the others in England and the United Kingdom as it became. And against that backdrop, I think national government almost always co-located or located in the city with the city's government, always feeling slightly uncomfortable that such a large city with all the potential for disorder that it brought with it was so close by to the seat of government. But I'll say a little bit more about that as we go along. So the first thing to note is, as I say, serious and damaging events have occurred regularly, often with similar consequences. So if we just sort of deconstruct for a moment what I mean by that. The first, I think, is that there is fear of bad things happening. I think if you live in a big... I was walking along Fleet Street to come here, and I was put in mind of one of my favourite old British films that some of you may have seen, it's called The Day the Earth Caught Fire. And this is a film largely set in this area, and it's fascinating to see inside the then Daily Express building. But it, like a lot of films made in big cities, it plays on the slight sense of threat that cities bring with them. People who live there know this, and they can, at some level, they quite like it because they feel that they can survive the threat. Don't want too much of it, but there it is. But walking, The Day the Earth Caught Fire, along with many other films, captures a sense of the threat to the city, which you can see in films about New York and other places around the world, which I think is much loved by filmmakers, partly because we do have a fear that the impacts of such events will be bigger in cities than if you lived in a house in the country with your own generator and a septic tank. It's just you're more vulnerable if you're all living together in one place. Then there's the event itself. Almost always partly expected. I mean, none of us precisely expected COVID-19, but there have been pandemics. Older people in this audience tonight, including me, will have witnessed polio and smallpox epidemics and been inoculated against them when I was a child. And we've had Ebola visiting the city from, coming with people from overseas. And the sense that there might be a major pandemic was just within the lives of, as it were, my parents and grandparents, the influenza epidemic of 1918, for example. So the occurrence itself is not as much of a shock as perhaps we now think think the next one's going to be. There are immediate impacts on the city and on its infrastructure and its people. There's economic and social dislocation. This is a common effect. And then a period of recovery, which, as I'm going to argue, can sometimes be very, very short and sometimes ominously long, of which more in a moment. There will be longer-term consequences, and Paul's already referenced this. So the Great Fire of London led to radical improvements in building regulations. The fire at Grenfell Tower more recently will have the same effect, which is not to say these are not desperately bad things, but they do bring learning with them. The King's Cross fire in 1987 led to massive improvements in transport safety for all of us ever since. anti-terrorism measures, public health programs, all in their way, have come out of learning from these bad events when they occur. There are permanent effects from these kind of events to the way people see London and city life more generally. I've already mentioned the disaster movie, disaster film idea, but I think there is a sort of what academics are fond of calling a sort of sorting issue. That is that some people who like living in cities and are prepared to put up with all the threats, various, will think even more than before, this is what we want, and other people will think, no, we've had enough, we're going to live a bit further away, we'll come and visit occasionally, but we'll take advantage of this to move us to somewhere else. So, I mean, so there are long-term implications to the way people see cities and city life more generally, and okay, as I say, the other thing is you get survival. The city survives. I'm giving a clue to the end of the lecture here, and there is further development. We learn things, and the city moves on. So COVID-19 is the latest in a long line of London-threatening events. Not only London, New York, Manchester, Edinburgh. It's not only London, big cities. I mean, social distancing, which we've all had to learn to live with, is the enemy of the very concentration and the ecosystem that cities require. We have to be crowded together to enjoy things, to come to churches, whatever it is we want to do. And that does bring with it concentration of people. And that, of course, is a long way from social distancing. Now, I'm going to argue that COVID fits the established long-term pattern of many major and smaller damaging events which have affected London. As I've said already, many of them also affect other cities. There have been large fires and large epidemics in Paris and New York and other cities, and indeed other cities in the United Kingdom. London is lucky in some ways. It's not built on, for example, a geographical fault line, unlike like San Francisco or Tokyo or Christchurch, where desperate damage is done by earthquakes. We've not had to worry about that here. It's avoided major dislocations of government. This is a bit like a constitutional lecture, because of the long evolved, the 1,000-year evolved constitutional arrangements in England and then the United Kingdom. So the conquest of 1066, it is 1066 this time, 1649, the end of the Civil War and the end of Charles I, and the Glorious Revolution in 1688, all led to, they were tumultuous events at the time, but actually the government of the country, and certainly in the case of 1066, King William accepted the City of London as a money-making mercantile enterprise, built the Tower of London outside to keep an eye on it, and everything sort of carried on. So, in a sense, the constitutional continuity and evolution in England and then the UK has allowed London itself an incredible degree of continuity. The City of London, after all, was given a charter by King William in 1067, and it still has it and still functions today. And what appears to be the case, after all of these events, that the economic advantage of a massive city, the political power that is contained within it at the city level, and in this case, because it's a capital, at the national level, and the cultural, a sort of social and cultural curiosity that bringing people together in large cities combines, they appear together to deliver recovery and a further evolution of what London had previously become. So I'm going to go through, very briefly, a number of events, some of which I've already pre-signalled, one of which is much pre-signalled here, which is the end of Roman London, which is in many ways the bleakest of them, the Black Death, the Great Plague, the Great Fire, cholera epidemics, what's unkindly called Spanish flu. I'd call it the 1918-19 influenza. I mean, the Spanish, it's given their name, but in fact it was simply because it was reported in Spain rather better than elsewhere. So the 1918-19 flu, World War II and the Blitz, terrorism, the crash of 2008-9, and then COVID-19, and occasional periodic disorder, which is a slightly different issue, but I'm going to argue is in some ways related. So we're now on the first picture here, which is the city was established by the Romans, and having been established about 2,000 years ago, it peaked Londinium, Roman London, peaked around 120 to 135, and thereafter declined, even when the Roman Empire still existed and it was itself beginning to erode. London began to erode with it. London, as a Roman city, had a maximum population of 45,000. This elegant drawing to artist's impression does make it look a very well-organized place. I sometimes think, long before this lecture, that the Romans had managed central heating, and we only had central heating put in our house in about 1970. So it was quite a long gap between some of the home comforts that the Romans brought to us and their return to dear Britain. But, of course, the wall, which still is present in bits around the City of London, was built to protect it, particularly in the latter years, from barbarian incursion. In the end, as we know, sort of one of those first dates we all learn when we're doing history, in 410, London was abandoned by Rome, wouldn't come to its defence from the earlier mentioned attacks from outside, and it was left to protect itself. There were anglicised Britons here, but they were not able to defend themselves, and within 40 years of then, 40 to 50 years, the city lay in ruins. And thus it remained. This is the bleakest of all the bad things that have happened to London, because it then effectively lay in ruins for 150 or more years, till Anglo-Saxons began to settle a new city, a new version of London, down towards the Aldwych, where the LSE and King's College are. Some thoughtful person has a coffee shop called London Wick, which is the Anglo-Saxons' name for their city, at the Aldwych. We go and drink coffee there at, no doubt, significant expense today. So there are the Anglo-Saxons. And Saxon London begins in the 7th century, but it takes King Alfred, the great, remarkable person in many ways. King Alfred believed in the value of education and teaching ordinary people to read, and culture, and it took him really fully to restore London and to move his version of London back into the ruins. I mean, it's an extraordinary thought that there were the ruins of Roman London and the wall were somewhat to the east of where the Anglo-Saxon city had been built. He moved it back. St. Paul's was established, of course, by the Anglo-Saxons. London had still to put up with Viking attacks from time to time. But notwithstanding these invasions, London remained a relatively protected place by the wall, and it was still able to trade along the river, as the Romans had originally noted it was well located for, out into other cities around Europe that were developing their own mercantile traditions. And of course, it is the Saxon Edward the Confessor who then builds Westminster Abbey, long way away in Westminster, establishing a sort of city and Westminster duality, which is still with us today. I walked, through London or past Temple Bar here on the way coming here this evening, which is of course the historic division today or now between the City of London and the City of Westminster, and this the establishment of effectively the royal seat and the large cathedral at Westminster created, I say, a sort of separation between the mercantile City of London and Westminster as a place of religion and government, which is not to say there isn't lots of religion here, courtesy of Sir Christopher Wren as well, that still is a part of our understanding of the city today. But the crucial point we have to derive from this is that it took 150 years for Saxon London to start, and almost 400 years for the city to be restored to a significant scale. So by 900, the city had a population, or London had a population of between 14 and 18,000, so well below Roman London at its peak. And this would be like us today in 2021, looking back at a city which had previously been at its peak in 1621. So this is a very long difficult period for London, not one that has mercifully been repeated in quite that way since. From this point onwards, from 1066 and all that, population rises from around 18,000 by that time to as much as 80,000 by the early part of the 14th century. So significant growth in a relatively tiny place, very high densities. The city was a very, very dense place indeed. And of course, the first of the Black Death episodes occurs in 1348 to 49, killing perhaps 35 to 40% of that population. So an incredible toll on the city of the time. There were further epidemics in 1381, 1369, 1471, 1479, 1565, 1575, 1603, which is also not a great year, and 1645. And here we've got, actually this is from the later period, but a very of our time wood carving of people fleeing London because of these plagues and being sent back by people in the countryside who, for understandable reasons, didn't want them. So again, for those of you who think what happened at the beginning of COVID, when people went to their country homes and so on, discovered people in parts of the rest of the country weren't over keen on people coming from London, this is not new. The other thing that's not new is that the population fell substantially, far more than it will have done relatively because of COVID, and that resulted in labour shortages, higher wages and inflation. Again, something I will revisit in a moment. So that was, these were episodes of Black Death. Then in 1665 comes the Great Plague, the biggest version of all of this, when 70 to 100,000 people died, 20 to 25% of a much bigger population. So this is another of these excellent woodcuts, which you can easily see in more detail online. And all I can say is not good things are happening in all 9 of the pictures, as the city came to terms with the need to identify the plague, identify homes where the Great Plague existed, bury the dead at scale, and so on. So these were very bad moments for the city. On the other hand, an early sign of how good things can come from bad things, which is bills of mortality. The legislation was passed requiring parish clerks throughout what became Inner London. What is today's Inner London was before that the area of the London County Council. In that area, parish clerks were required to to make returns to the City of London, telling them about the number of people being buried periodically. So this is early public health. This is, like Google monitoring people looking up sore throats or things. This is an early version of a public health system, very sophisticated in its way. And the bills of mortality are something that we gained from the need to establish when plague was about to hit. The plague extended beyond the city into the surrounding sprawl. It wasn't much sprawl by this point, but here's a map of it. And here's the kind of chart, obviously drawn rather later, that we all of us see on the BBC every night. This was, of course, of the plague at its most dramatic in numbers of deaths per month. And it was, very, very shocking in terms of the scale of the deaths that were caused. People again left the city for the surrounding areas, and again, in the Great Plague, it ended with higher wages and inflation. 1 year later, in the Great Plague, comes, of course, the Great Fire. A defining moment in London's history, and a date known, I think, by school children for hundreds of years since it occurred. But immediately after the Great Plague, which must have made people think long and hard, because it's well chronicled, not only by Samuel Pepys, well charted at that time, and of course rewritten and turned into drama regularly subsequently. 80% of the city was destroyed. Intriguingly, the wind was blowing unusually from east to west, so the remaining pre-fire housing you can see in London is actually in Tower Hamlets, just over the border from the city. But it extraordinarily led to virtually no loss of life. It happened just slowly enough, with enough information about it, to avoid virtually any loss of life. But people had to move to camps outside the city and to more distant towns. In the weeks after the fire, many homeless residents left the city for towns surrounding it, and the government considered it critical to begin reconstruction because, and I quote, "before the population of London dispersed to such an extent they would never come back." So there was a fear that London would disperse forever, that people wouldn't come back. So an act for the rebuilding of the City of London led to a number of changes, including, of course, a large number of churches being built, building regulations, St. Paul's Cathedral. Interestingly, others will have known this, when I was preparing for the lecture, I discovered that Sir Christopher Wren was so unconvinced by the previous version of the cathedral, which had burnt down, particularly its foundations, that he moved it onto a slightly different axis, so it's almost in the same place, but on a slightly different axis to the previous version of St. Paul's. Many new public buildings, and rather grand ones, were built, and a tax was put on coal to help pay for the rebuilding. This also led the fire to the beginnings of the insurance industry in London as well. So a lot of things happened as a result of the fire. One thing that didn't happen, of course, as we all know, and I realise an earlier lecture in this series makes this point, that no grid pattern of streets emerged, none of the sort of Baron Haussmann or the New York City Commissioners style grid, oh no, because owners of land, including the church, wanted to build their properties back or on the original sites of their homes, building commercial buildings and indeed churches. It was a terribly bad event for the city. The governor of Chester Castle reported that, and I quote, "all are in amazement at the heavy judgment fallen on London, which is concluded to be total devastation and the destruction of the metropolis." So this was it. London was seen as destroyed, and that people might never come back. But of course, from the government's point of view, the importance of London to the national exchequer meant that government tax revenues collapsed, and that alone, if nothing else, as with the Treasury today when they're considering levelling up and everything, the thought that London's tax payment and the extent to which it supports the rest of the UK is a major issue in thinking about the future of the city from within central government. It took 10 years for London to be rebuilt, but at the end of that period, London was left with modern infrastructure and some of the most beautiful buildings in the world. So again, not a good thing, the fire, though relatively little death from it, leading to remarkable modernisation of the city. I couldn't help putting, because this is a slightly glum lecture, but last year when the roadmap, remember road maps and COVID? Well, Matt in the Daily Telegraph came up with this excellent cartoon showing people looking at the burning city, saying, is this part of the roadmap out of the Great Plague? So some historical resonance there, even for cartoonists. Now, in this canter through the bad things, and there are other bad things we could add to this list, let's move on to cholera. Now, cholera epidemics took place in London in 1832, 1848, 9, 1854 and 1866. There were also influenza and typhoid epidemics in 1837 and 1838. Now, the death toll from these events was less. There were fewer people died. And what happened is by now we've got a much more sophisticated form of government. The government is bigger, and there are lots of reformers. This is a period when we begin to see middle-class reformers pressing Parliament for change. So we see immediate pressure in Parliament for public health legislation and reforms that created in the Metropolitan Water Board and the Metropolitan Board of Works. I will not in a church repeat some of the dismal awfulness of the sewage and water supply problems. We probably all have read about them in the past. But they were dismal, and here's a picture of the health board going around looking for cholera. So we have now the idea of public health and reform of public health becoming a challenge for government. And as I say, reformers, Edwin Chadwick famously, going out there and trying to press Parliament for reforms. This, of course, creates another actually nice graphic, just showing you how populous London was. The poor particularly suffered from cholera and typhoid. For the rich, they were able to buy bigger homes, leave the city for the summer or at the weekend, aristocrats and all of that, upstairs and downstairs a bit later. So this was very much an illness that centred on the poor. There were typically 5,000 to 15,000 deaths during cholera outbreaks, and of course the difficulty that treating cholera had is that people thought it was spread via the air. It was miasmic. That you can imagine with London fogs, they might well have thought that, and the smell, which must have been dismal by any standards. And of course it took Dr. John Snow, famously now immortalised with a water pump with a broken handle in Soho, who realised it was water that was the problem. The other thing that was the problem is that we have cartoonists who again are now beginning in Punch and other magazines to satirise efforts by the government to do something. Here's a poor man trying to work out which of various unhelpful looking treatments, blue pills or emetics, the Board of Health is recommending. So we can begin to see here the kind of pressure government health officials have been under, but at this point this is in the 1840s and 1850s. Having said all of this, London grew very rapidly. This was a period when London was growing from being a city of 1 million people via the railways and other expansion to a city of 4 or 5 million people. So what we learn from cholera, and the fact it's concentrated on the poor, is that it doesn't stop the city growing and developing. As industrialisation is taking place right across England, right across the UK by this point, it's certainly also happening in London. So this is an example of a fact. I mean, I'm not an epidemiologist, obviously, but how, in a sense, London came to live with cholera, which I suspect is what's going to happen with COVID-19, of which others know more about this, obviously, than me. On we now come to 1918 and the flu epidemic, which, now this is a very interesting parallel, probably the nearest contemporary parallel to COVID-19. There were 16,300 deaths, a quarter of the national total in London. These pieces of advertising and propaganda are for face masks, they are for social distancing, they're for keeping windows open. So we've been here before. The Oxo company, of course, effectively implying that if you drink their luscious beef drink product, you'll be protected. So even advertisers haven't changed that much. I'm not having a go at Oxo, but well done them. But the interesting thing about this is that this came immediately after the Great War. And there was almost a sort of not only censorship by the press, but self-censorship by individuals. So very little is written about it. If you go and look at all your history books at home about London, you'll find there's very little about this particular epidemic. And the horrors of the Great War had been such that it was as if people collectively just couldn't stand anymore. So it was just dealt with. There were isolation hospitals. The newly created, relatively newly created London County Council took the lead. It built isolation hospitals and tried to protect people that way. There were all of these public health measures, but there was no closure of non-essential businesses. Public transport continued to work. It was really left up to individuals and gentle messaging, but the economy continued. So there was much less of an effect, in fact, on the economy, little economic impact. There was a significant social one. And in a sense, this is coming so soon as it had done after the Great War, not unlike, from London's point of view, the Great Fire immediately following the Great Plague. World War II. Now, World War II, by now, government is significantly more organised, both at the London level and at the national level. As soon as World War II broke out, Children were given gas masks at school. Well, everybody was given gas masks. The government was ready. And mass evacuations took place from London and other big cities, from Birmingham as well, out to places where it was thought would not be bombed. Because, of course, one of the big differences between World War II and World War I is that in World War I, although there had been Zeppelin attacks on London, they were relatively few in number. Whereas it was known that by the outbreak of World War II, it was going to be in part an air war, more than also being a sea war and a land war. So this led to mass evacuations. There was a fear of gas and aerial bombardment, rightly. And of course, parts of government and the BBC moved out of London. I was born and brought up in a seaside town in North Wales, where great chunks of government went to, and the BBC went nearby. Part of the BBC was moved there too, so as to protect them from an imagined targeting of them by enemy bombers. Now, the war in the air led to huge dislocation for the London economy. It led to significant numbers of deaths, but significant dislocation. So two pictures here, the one on the left, Selfridges, still highly recognisable as Selfridges. Terrible, a big bomb went off there. There's an analogous one for John Lewis nearby on Oxford Street. But the more haunting one in some ways on the other side is of a view downstream of bombing of the docks, and there are some, amazingly evocative and shocking pictures of the docks and the fire brigade and the auxiliary fire brigade, and you can see why so much of this is built into our national, not myth isn't quite the word, our national understanding of ourselves. This is St Bride's Fleet Street. Many churches were damaged, as they had been in the Great Fire. And I'll come on to that one in a minute. So the whole of life was affected. So it was not just the economy. Individuals, there were parts of London, in Stoke Newington, in the graveyard at Abney Park, there's a very moving memorial to civilians in streets who were all bombed one night and killed large numbers of civilians. So it really was a home fire, a home front as well as an overseas front in the war. Now the war, partly because of the movement of people out and a sense that too much of the economy had been concentrated in London, led to a permanent reduction in London's population and policies to decentralised industries and planners. When I was talking to a friend about this lecture, he said, you must talk about Sir Patrick Abercrombie and planning. Well, I'm not going to go into a planning lecture, but it is worth saying, and Paul knows more about this than anybody, I suspect, that planners believed in decentralising, getting rid of slums by moving people away from inner London, which was very densely populated, and building new homes, especially after the war with a new Labour government and the welfare state. But anyway, the sum total of this is a long-term decline within the London County Council area, the inner London area, and a move outwards into outer London, and then beyond that into the wider south-east. There was at this time, of course, a major push as part of the welfare state for more social housing, and again, I love feature films as a way of understanding this. If you look at the film that Barbara Windsor first made, a Joan Littlewood film called Sparrows Can't Sing, which was actually, I think, originally a play. It has as its central idea working class Londoners in the East End being moved out of their homes and into new high-rises, which to me anyway then, looked like the Royal Festival Hall. These are with bathrooms, inside facilities, all the panoply of things that nobody living in so-called slum accommodation had ever had. And you can see why architecture and planners thought they were doing good. You only have to see films like this. There are plenty of documentaries about it as well. But it led to a thinning out of the inner London population, much better housing, but a thinning out of the population. And I think it's possible to argue that the Second World War produced this outward movement and changes that affected the London economy, which were still working their way through in the 1980s. And that really took 40 years for this particular series of changes fully to work through. The population of London had been 8.6 million in 1939. It only recovered to that about 4 years ago. So this was a big change. Now, outer London, of course, had grown in population. Inner London still has a population 1 million smaller today than it was in 1939. Now, I mentioned things that are not sort of big disaster, big impacts of the kind I've mentioned so far, which is disorder, riot, and catastrophe, as I've called it here. And I'm a bit cautious about talking about them, but they are important. If you search on any of the major search engines and you put in, London, disorder, riot, and catastrophe, a huge number comes out. And they are very different from each other, and I want slightly to differentiate from them. But it's worth noting why they happen, which is, as I said earlier on, London is the seat of the royal family and the government and Parliament, the media. Many national headquarters are here. And it's the stage upon which much violent disorder and indeed other disorder has played out. And you can see why it might be. If you're staging an event or a protest of some kind, you'll get more interest and coverage in it here than if you do it in a field in Lincolnshire. So you can see why, or indeed in another city, you can see why people think like this. Now, some of this violent disorder is actually violence against minorities, or the legitimate response by the oppressed to the violence. So the Gordon riots here, anti-Catholic riots, not good, and then Cable Street, anti-Jewish fascist riots on the other side. So these are, in a sense, cause, and you can see how they, in a sense, why the response took place in the way it did. Others are more straightforwardly political. On the left, we've got the poll tax riots in March, 31st of March, 1990, and on the right, the disturbances that took place in 2011 in Tottenham, Croydon, and many other parts of the city. And then, of course, there's terrorism. On the right there, an IRA bombing in the city in 1990s, and on the left, a bleak sign on the M11 on the 7th of July 2005, where the Highways Agency in its wisdom put up a sign saying, "Avoid London, area closed, turn on radio." So terrorism is another element, and terrorism certainly goes back to the 19th century. It's not a new phenomenon affecting the city. And then last in this slightly odd subcategory, there are sort of localized catastrophes. Ronan Point, the collapse of a system-built social tower block in Newham in the late 1960s, happened early in the morning. That was everybody's kitchen. So if it had happened at breakfast time, hundreds of people would have died. As it happened, it was very early in the morning and a smaller number died. The Moorgate Tube disaster in 1975, top middle, King's Cross fire in 1987 at the bottom, and most recently, the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. Now, why are these things, I put them in my list? Because they're important in shaping the city's image, and I think they tell us something about the way, certainly for those of us who live in the city, we feel embraced by it, how we feel treated by the city of which we are a part. So I do think these need to be added into the broader picture. And this brings us, after all this time, to the purpose of the evening's event, which is COVID-19. And I've just two simple images here. One of Piccadilly Circus, as it was once called, hub of the empire, a place, an intensely busy place day and night, normally totally empty. We're back to the disaster film view of London. If those of you who've seen disaster films, it always looks a bit like this. They have to film it normally at sort of 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning in midsummer. You could have done it at any time of the day during the early lockdowns. Outside my kitchen window is the telecom tower, well, not literally outside, but within, you can see it like this, saying stay at home, save the NHS. And of course, COVID is, as I hope I've implied so far, in a long line of events and incidents which have affected London in a particular way, precisely because it's a massive, powerful, densely populated city. Now, the impacts that we've seen with COVID-19 include many witnessed before. Illness and death and the fear of the epidemic, obviously. Social distancing, the closure of theatres and cinemas. That's happened before. William Shakespeare had to struggle to put on his plays in London for that reason during his life here. Pressure on hospitals and social care. That's happened many times before. Reduction in economic activity, temporarily, but this time with some differences of which more in a moment. The use of emergency power by government, I'm not going to go into that tonight, but you see government empowered, as in the Second World War, to pass legislation radically to alter the way our lives are governed. And by the way, square bracket, I think Parliament was rather better at scrutinising those powers in the Second World War than it has been this time. That's a tiny bit of politics thrown in. And another thing that happens again and again is that the rich and mobile, if they can, will leave. This has happened so many times, I'm amazed anybody was surprised it happened this time. Mostly temporarily. Generally they'll come back when they sense that things have, and in fairness, I know people who did this, and if you've got another home outside London, you can see why people might have done it, but they generally come back. They generally come back. Now, what's new this time, I think, is furloughing. Now, furloughing is a fascinating thing. Furloughing and business support and support for local government and other public services comes about because of the scale of the state, its sophistication, and the very possibility of doing such a thing. Because almost all the earlier events I've talked about, and certainly in 1918, the idea that you could effectively pay people for not working by the state borrowing vast sums of money and indeed printing large sums of money, I think unimaginable. So this tells us something, what's happened this time, about not only our expectations of the state, the national state, but of the capacity of it, in a very sophisticated way, to do things which would never have been possible before. The same is true of, obviously, many health interventions and the massive speed with which vaccine was created. So, what does history tell us about the potential longer-term impact of COVID? Well, I think the first thing is that recovery won't be immediate. That's one thing. And then the question is it not immediate 1 year or 400 years? Well, it's not going to be 400 years, but it might not be 3. There'll be lasting benefits, even from such a bad thing, remembering what I've said before about the bills of mortality, building regulation, public health changes after World War II, and so on. Actually, public health changes during the Second World War led to lower mortality rates, intriguingly. Higher wages and inflation, we'd have been able to predict that if we'd been having this conversation a year ago. But there will be medium-term challenges to the economy of inner and central London, as was the case after plagues, the Great Fire, and World War II. You only have to walk around the streets to see a number of businesses have failed, but increasingly and intriguingly, many new ones are opening. I'm fascinated by the number of new shops and new restaurants opening. I read IKEA is opening at Topshop, where Topshop was at Oxford Circus. We've got lots of change, not so good for the people who've lost their jobs, but very good for people who wanted to start new businesses, and younger people who couldn't afford to live as near to the city centre and were often living in pretty dismal conditions, in my view, who now have a slightly greater chance of living in better conditions. And more working from home will liberate space for new businesses. If you imagine that half of people work at home half the time, then, other things being equal, a quarter of the office space that was previously being used and shop space will be available for new people to set up businesses, new organisations to move in, and creativity to flourish. So I think, what will happen is sorting, as I've mentioned it earlier, will leave some people further from central London, while others move in. That, I think, is likely to happen relatively swiftly, and may even be happening already. Now, where might action be required by government? Well, once some kind of normality is restored, and you can have a debate as to whether we've got to that point yet, so there are some key challenges for government, and by government I mean central government, city hall government, and the boroughs. Now, what kind of city centre jobs will be done from elsewhere, and for what proportion of the week? Now, at first sight, or if people say, well, people are going to move out a bit, that's fine. But we used to have sort of Paris and other densely populated cities as a model. Would we want Los Angeles as a model? Los Angeles is a wonderful city, but if everybody moved out a bit, London would resemble Los Angeles more, i.e. the further you move from the point we're standing on the earth, outwards, more people use cars at its simplest. So there'd be a profound environmental consequence of allowing a significant outward movement. The other risk is that if you walk around central London, particularly on busy days, and most of it is very busy in the restaurants and theatres, and I think theatres are doing very well, I'm told, shops and so on, it's in central London, really quite busy. But then again, then the threat is what I would call a sort of Venice threat. Venice always looks busy if you visit it in the holiday season, but actually that's not enough to drive a proper economy. Venice needs more of a full-time economy. So there has to be more to London than, wonderful though they are, restaurants, museums, and all the things that this sort of creative and sort of entertainment industry will bring. They in turn rely on office workers and tourists. So we have to be slightly wary what we wish for. So that begs a question about whether government would seek to reverse its messaging to encourage people back to work in city centres. At the moment, you can see the government is kind of on both sides of the argument, so we'll have to wait and see which way they eventually move. They have to worry about our safety, of course. Some people prefer to work from home, and there are equalities issues tangled up in that. All of that will have to work its way through the system. And of course, there is a big issue, I think, and I've already hinted at this, some issue. If people didn't come back to work in central London and or live in central, or fewer lived in central London, there's a risk there would be permanent damage to the United Kingdom as a whole if sectors such as theatre and the live arts and culture, civil aviation and the railways were damaged. 60% of all railway journeys made in the United Kingdom are made, or in Britain, are made either to London or from London or within London. So if London doesn't recover and the railways don't recover, it'll be the National Railway that doesn't recover. And the same is true of the theatre, and lots of things to do with Britain's soft power. So there's a lot to think about there. And then I think there's the big question for policymakers is what new purposes can be found for less intensively used properties? So, is there a role for government in ensuring that we get a better mix of businesses, perhaps more small businesses, on high streets or in central London, new businesses for sure, and so on. So, and then my last point is, should government wait and see, sort of Doris Day, que sera, sera approach, or decide what it wants to deliver and use policy to deliver it? So, I'm on the last few seconds. Am I optimistic or pessimistic? Should we be optimistic and pessimistic to be less self-loving? Well, I am broadly optimistic. I am broadly optimistic, partly on the basis of this long history and the city's capacity to rebuild and renew and attract more people in. I think COVID more than anything resembles endemic cholera in the 19th century and the 1918-19 influenza epidemic. It resembles them for obvious reasons more than the departure of the Romans, the Great Fire or World War II. I think there are things we can learn from all of those, but I think it's these pandemics and epidemics that tell us rather more. The impact has been concentrated. I haven't really talked about this issue, but all the impacts I'm talking about, the sort of ones that threaten the city, are generally in central London. If you visit outer London town centres, and many of you may live there, they've done rather well out of some of this. More money's been spent in restaurants and shops in outer London centres. Now that may be a benefit that lasts. So, we mustn't forget the rest of the wider London area. But, and I know this is a cliche, I've often thought London is like an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem of people, buildings, all the things that go on between them, different sectors, public and private, and voluntary, all these people and institutions and ideas all working together. And as in we've all seen dismal footage of forest fires, and the film crew turns up and you see all the forest destroyed and the animals all killed and all the dire things that happen when forest fires occur. And yet, if you're lucky, a year or 18 months later, a film crew will go back and show how everything's green and growing again and new animals have moved in and the forest has recovered. Indeed, not an expert on forestry, but there's an element of the way they're managed, I think, in that. And my hope and hunch is that London and other big cities in Britain will spring back into life, driven by the analogous interplay of people, ideas, creativity, and, dare I mention it, money. So, my final thought, and thank you for listening, is London, as this history suggests, is probably here to stay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Okay.
Well, Tony, I think the enthusiastic reception is a tribute to your wonderful tour d'horizon of things that have happened in London in relation to all kinds of natural or self-generated disasters. We have time for a few questions. We've got a virtual audience as well who've been enjoying the talk this evening. And I wonder if I could just kick off, and then I'll ask people from the audience if they'd like to ask a question. Can I ask you a question about whether you think that in the post-pandemic and possibly post-Grenfell condition, that the relationship between national government, mayoral government and borough authority, do you think there'll be a rebalancing of this?
It's a good question. Do I need still to... Is this all still being picked up by...
Yeah.
It is, okay, right. I mean, there's no question that we are going to stray slightly into politics here, but in a non-political way. Obviously, national government, because of the emergency powers and the need for there to be a national response, certainly within England, complicated with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but not complicated, but they have their own sets of powers and laws. There's no doubt we had to allow, as in the Second World War, national government to make a lot of the running, pass the laws, and so on. What we also learned is a local response, not only in London, was hugely important, i.e. the boroughs or the council, depending on which part of the country you're in, do know where people, they know what neighbourhoods are, which the neighbourhoods and wards are, where people live, who needs help, who's getting help from social services and so on. So when it comes to targeted messaging about vaccination or getting food or whatever it was in the early days of lockdowns, not being cut off from society altogether, in some ways the most local level of government was in a better position. And of course, national government had the resources and the powers, so there was a sort of slight jumping over City Hall, I think, made more complicated by the fact that City Hall had to go to government for massive bailouts, not its fault, because tube and bus ridership dropped by 90%. So 90% of the revenue, or 90% of the fare revenue had gone. So, there was a fractious relationship between the mayor and the government, both of them somewhat to blame, neither of them completely to blame, because there was an election about to happen. So that made it all very political. So I think that the government worked slightly over the head of City Hall, working with boroughs, borough chief executives and leaders, and that probably was because of this balance between national power and the need for local, fairly sensitive understanding of who was vulnerable, who needed help, and how to keep basic services. I mean, one of the most amazing things for me about this, having been in the city all the way through the pandemic, is every single week the refuse collection and every day where I live, the streets were swept and the refuse collection and all these services continued. An amazing, example of civilization, really, and one that we take for granted. Well, I take for granted, or had taken for granted. So I think there was a bit of a reordering, and it was to the local from the centre, and quite a strong link there, slightly bypassing City Hall, if I'm honest.
It is amazing, I think, in the City of London, you might call it a dirty little secret of the construction sector, but the reality is construction did not stop in the City of London, and some of the biggest buildings this city has ever seen. Construction carried on. Forget about lockdown. The building workers were in there every day. The construction sector was quite good at working out social distancing and reorganising sites. But they never stopped, really extraordinary. I'd like any questions from the audience. Yes, please, do tell us who you are. And there's a microphone coming your way just now. Thank you.
My name is Christopher Wren. You didn't mention the next natural catastrophe, which is just ahead of us, which is, of course, climate change and sea level rise. It's going to obliterate most of the south of London and a lot of the north side of the Thames. Would you like to include that in your list?
Well, as it happens, I was going to use an image, because I thought this was all looking a bit glum. So I was going to put in an image of things that hadn't happened in London. I was cautious about that. I decided not to, partly because I thought it might tempt fate. So one of them was massive power outages, which other cities, even very sophisticated cities like New York, have terrible power. Sorry. One of the things we don't have as badly, or we don't really have at all, Britain as a whole, has relatively few power cuts. Whereas in New York City, they have terrible power outages, as they call them. And there's some marvellous pictures of the whole of Manhattan in the dark. We don't have that. The other one I was going to use, and thank goodness I didn't, was the Thames Barrier. Now, I know the Thames Barrier was itself built partly in response to terrible flooding in the east of England in the early to mid-1950s. And therefore, it did come after a disaster and a tragedy, in Canby Island in particular. But it was amazingly built before London had flooded. I mean, normally you'd expect the flood to happen and then the disaster precaution to be, measure to be put in. Now, the reason I wasn't talking about the future, I take your point entirely about climate change and its potential impact on London. Reading a piece the other day about its potential impact on the whole of the Netherlands, but particularly Amsterdam. So I'm not, in any sense, denying that there's not a problem here. It's just I was trying to use the past rather than the future as my guide. But I take your point entirely. The question I think it immediately presents policymakers, though, is, given the uncertainty of convincing, as we're about to see, I suspect, the entire global community to change their behaviour, what preemptive measures does the government at all levels need to take to protect low-lying levels? And it can't just be put up another barrier or put a bigger barrier up, because that will just flood Essex and Kent, and that wouldn't be very good. So, we need to have proper measures in place to ensure that all those places in the country that are likely to be damaged by rising sea levels are as protected as is humanly possible, which I realise is not the same as stopping climate change.
Thank you. Another question, perhaps, from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you. Michael Lowndes. Really interesting, Tony. Really, the span of London history is fantastic. Two-part question. The first part is, in relation to the potential flight from London, and you talked about this possibility of people using cars in an ex-urban realm beyond London, but actually the truth is there won't be a flight from London because there isn't anywhere for us to go or afford. So actually there is a limit on who can leave London. So most of us will continue to stay here. And the second part of that question is the polycentric character of London a help or a hindrance in its long-term resilience? But also, what does that mean for the immediate recovery for central London, CAS, and the city?
Great question, all great questions. If we take I understand entirely that there's a limit to how many people can move out, and indeed, frankly, only affluent people who own property can really move out. Although that in itself, I mean, I've always, though I'm never quite got over reading, I can't remember who it was who, said that when they were an adolescent, not living in London, like me as an adolescent, always thought they wanted to move to London and then move as near to the centre as they could get there. And in his case, it was, to have a flat behind the Coca-Cola sign at Piccadilly Circus, which is slightly my own view, if I'm honest. But when I look then at the property pages of newspapers, I'm always amazed how cheap property is as soon as you get over the M25. You can buy, a moated oast house in Kent for £1 million, I make this up of course, £1.5 million, which I know is a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money to somebody who owns a 4-bedroom house in Clapham. So I think there is but the danger in all of this, I think, is that if you think about other things being equal, which they never are, but if a substantial number of people who can afford to cash in their housing in London moved out to buy more space, other things being equal, there'll be less homes, there'll be less space for everybody else. It's a mathematical certainty. So there are good equity reasons for not having too many people move out, as well as good reasons for the city and car use and so on. But I take your point. I think, but there's also another risk, is that some people move out and then buy a pied-à-terre and therefore end up with 2 properties instead. When they discover, and I'm not having a go at the institution I'm about to mention, that you can't quite as easily get to the Royal Opera House and back as they'd thought, then the little place, sorry, I love the Royal Opera House, I'm not going to go into it, but you know what I mean, that somehow then the pied-à-terre in Bloomsbury will be very attractive alongside the moated oast house. And that wouldn't be very good either for those who can't afford homes. So I think the point is that there are lots of equalities issues and equity issues tied up with these decisions. Equally and oppositely, most of the home counties, as it used to be called, don't really want lots of development, as we discovered from the Chesham and Amersham by-election. So in some ways, it's in everybody's interest for lots of people not to move out to the home counties, and from London's point of view, for them to stay put. And so I take your point entirely. As for the polycentric city, I mean, it's such a cool question, because there's no doubt that London is the batteries run out and it's immediately done. Super, thank you. So London has always been, partly because of the City of London, of course. City of London never changed its boundaries, therefore London sprawled, lots of units of government, very fragmented. We know this history, villages engulfed. And so, one of the intriguing things to me about the development of the last 25 years is that there are several town centres in inner and outer London that now have their own micro skyscrapers. Lewisham, Croydon always did, of course, recently, last 60 years did. Ilford now has its own skyscrapers. Parts of Ealing and Acton do. So I do think actually this is a resilience. And when I was talking about the risk of Venice, deep down, actually I know that. The thing about Venice is it's not surrounded by Greater London. So even if central London did become a bit more theatres and restaurants and entertainment, which has always done a lot of that, and a bit more employment was located in outer London, that probably wouldn't be so bad. You can still travel around on public transport. So I think the polycentricity is a strength. That's a short way of answering your question, and may benefit a little from this.
I'll take one more question if there is one. Otherwise, yes, please.
Thanks very much, Tony, for a great talk. John Evans, how do you think the impact of people working from home will affect the city, bearing in mind we're seeing Tuesday to Thursday being the sort of common working arrangements within the square mile, and what impact will that have on businesses such as hospitality and so on?
Well, I think the best way of thinking, I mean, it's another excellent question. I think if it only led to, as it were, all the people who were working in inner and central London in February 2020, if, some of them worked, half of them worked on Tuesday, all of them worked on Wednesday, and half of them worked on Thursday, and 10% of them worked on Friday, which seems to be the normal distribution that people are talking about. That's terribly wasteful of public transport resources. You get a ticketing, the operators of public transport would respond to that with a ticketing ticketing incentives. That's the first thing. It'd be very bad for small businesses. I feel personally genuinely saddened imagine you'd set up, a little, a nice sandwich and coffee shop in January last year, just outside here. And, you'd saved up, you'd got some money, you'd set it up, and it was all going well, and suddenly the government tells everybody to stay at home. Question. And you've made your decision on the basis of the economy as it worked. It was a good decision. You were going to work hard to make it work. And now, suddenly, because of something that wasn't outside your control, the government tells everybody to stay at home. Is there a moral, and it's a genuine question, I don't have an answer to this, is there a moral, there should be some sort of moral pressure on the government for your sake to reverse the messaging? You set up that business exactly knowing what the conditions were, and it was a good decision, and it's not your fault that everything changed. The government changed it by enacting, it didn't have to have a social distancing policy, but it chose to, and a stay-at-home policy. So I think that for some individuals and businesses, it's going to be bad. For others, it will be good, and it will, the other side of working from home is that for some people, the capacity to choose more when they work, stay at home with children and so on, all of that, and look after the dog and everything more often, is a liberation. And for some people who are not that mobile, it's a liberation. But then, of course, there's if I can again use an anecdote, I'm aware that in the 18 months before a month ago, I hadn't met a single new person in 18 months. In the last month, when it's been Liberty Hall back to normal events like this, I've met perhaps 25 new people who I've now made contacts with. So the social capital that we've all used and run down, I think would be very hard to build up if you just started a job. And I think people who don't go back to work much will lose out, and that's unfair in another way. So, you don't have to be an employment lawyer to see that this will lead to quite a lot of need to think through what's fair to everybody. But there'll be a new equilibrium. I think some people will go into work 5 days a week. People who used to go into work 6 days a week will still go in 6 days a week. I think, dare I say, often the rich and powerful will go in. There's another complicated argument. I think if you're rich and powerful, you don't, unless you go into work, you don't get any sense you're rich and powerful. That's rather a complicated idea which we can deconstruct. You don't have people running around after you, making you coffee and things. So there's all of that. And therefore I think other ambitious people will go in. And then there is a risk to people who choose not to. So I think we'll have to wait and see, treat everybody reasonably fairly, but in the space that's made available if people work at home, and it can't be everybody in on Wednesday, it's going to have to be spread out for everything's sake. Then there'll be more space for new businesses, more space for new opportunities, and that will create a rash of new businesses. That I would be certain about.
Well, I think that's an optimistic note to end on, and I suppose, in a sense, a sort of underlying theme of your talk this evening, Tony, has been about London, the resilient city. I mean, there have been other disasters, the Asian flu from 1957, which I think killed more than 50,000 people across the country, but it didn't result in any lockdown. I don't think London was specifically more badly affected than others. But cities do have a way of making extraordinary comebacks, which is why we're seeing, record rent levels in the City of London and the West End at the moment, despite the belief of some people that the office markets are all finished and we're all doomed. Well, actually the deals being done rather suggest otherwise. And if you look at the number of cranes in the city in the West End and in the outer London boroughs, there's no shortage of desire to carry on building, partly because of housing shortages and so on and so forth. So I took great comfort and pleasure from the talk this evening, because it was simultaneously an acknowledgement of the huge pressures and problems which we face, but on the other hand, an absolute refusal to go into a sort of 100% gloomy tunes analysis of where we are. I must say, from a personal point of view, the only thing that worries me about London is catastrophic flood, and I think that actually the decision to build the Thames Barrier, or to see it through, was the best thing that Ken Livingstone ever did. I don't think in retrospect he did very much else that was so wonderful. Second time round he was much better when he was mayor. But actually, up to a point, the fields of Kent and Essex can take water, but if the water comes over the Thames Barrier, the London Underground and our communication system absolutely cannot carry it. Now, I'll enjoy asking Tony after this evening what he thinks might be the possibilities of getting the finance together to build a second Thames Barrier, because it will probably take us 30 years from inception to completion to do it. And there seems to be an odd attitude on the part of the Environment Agency that if it's a 1 in 500 year risk, that it can't happen next week. Well, as we found out with the pandemic, we know bad things are going to happen. What we don't know is precisely when. As a final, unusually, I've never done this before in 10 years, but a recommendation for a book which is called Radical Uncertainty, co-authored by Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England. And it does deal, it was written before the pandemic, though interestingly, it sort of prefigured it without predicting it. And it's a very interesting sort of speculation about economic history, very broadly drawn from many different disciplines. And for anybody who's interested, as I think most of this audience is, in, shall we call it the history of the immediate future, and the inevitable uncertainties that accompanies that, I think you would find it a very stimulating read. Well, it's my final duty and pleasure to thank again the church for hosting this event, being so involved with the Wren Talks, the Wren Insurance Group, but in particular on your behalf and those of you who are have beamed in online and will have the opportunity to catch up on demand if you so wish. I'd like to thank Professor Tony Travers for a really stimulating, broad-reaching, and I think above all, optimistic, sensibly optimistic view that times are tough, but we're not all doomed. Tony, thank you very much indeed.